Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are opening up what might just be the most X-Files file in the entire Bible.
Oh, absolutely.
We are talking about Genesis chapter 6.
Hmm.
And honestly, if you think the Bible is just about people in robes walking quietly through deserts, you need to wait till we get into this.
Yeah.
We're talking about sons of God, daughters of men, and a mysterious group of beings called the Nephilim.
Or giants.
Or giants, yeah.
It really is one of those passages that just stops you cold. You know, you're reading along in Genesis, tracing the lineage of Adam so-and-so begat so-and-so, and then suddenly you hit these 4 verses.
Right.
And they feel like they fell out of a sci-fi novel or a mythology textbook. The whole narrative just shifts from human history into something, well, frankly, terrifying.
Terrifying is the right word. And the problem is, this specific passage is a massive source of confusion.
Yeah.
I remember reading this and thinking, wait, who are the sons of God? Are we talking about aliens? Angels? Just some regular guys who hit the gym too much? It feels like everyone has a different theory, and they all contradict each other.
Well, that's because the implications of the answer, they change everything. They change how you view the early history of the world. So today, we aren't just summarizing a story. We are performing what's basically a forensic audit of the text.
A forensic audit.
I like that. We're going to look at 3 major historical viewpoints on this mystery: the grammar, the history, the logical consistency, and just see what actually holds up.
And the mission here is pretty clear. We need to decode the identity of these beings. But it's more than that. We need to understand why their actions were considered so catastrophic that they actually triggered the Great Flood.
Exactly.
Because usually when we hear about the flood, we just think people were, being bad. But the text suggests something much, much darker was happening.
Absolutely. And if we follow the evidence where it leads, it lands us on this compelling argument for the reality of spiritual warfare. And I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean a literal, actual conflict that affects how we view modern problems.
It's a wild journey then, from ancient giants to modern conflict resolution. But we have to start with the identity crisis. So let's unpack the big question first. The text introduces these characters called the sons of God. In the Hebrew, Bene Ha'Elohim. Who on earth, or maybe off earth, are they?
So there are 3 main theories that have been battling it out for centuries. The first one is what we might call the safe option. In theological circles, this is known as the Sethite View.
The safe option? I'm guessing it's called safe because it doesn't involve monsters.
Precisely. It keeps everything grounded in human history. The logic here is that the sons of God refers to the male descendants of Seth.
Okay, Seth, Adam's 3rd son.
Right. His line is described as the godly line, the people who began to call upon the name of the Lord.
Okay, so in this theory, the sons of God are just the good church-going guys of the ancient world. So then, who are the daughters of men?
In this view, they are the female descendants of Cain.
Ah, the bad seed.
Cain, of course, was the bad seed. The son who murdered his brother was exiled. His line represents the ungodly, or, the secular world. So the conflict here is interpreted as a mixed marriage problem, believers marrying non-believers.
I see. So the sin isn't something supernatural or cosmic, it's just moral compromise. The godly men saw the secular women, thought they were beautiful, and compromised their values to marry them.
Exactly. And this view is incredibly popular in many traditional churches and with reformers like Calvin and Luther. And you can see why it avoids all the supernatural weirdness.
Yeah, I've tried it.
It turns the story into a practical cautionary tale about, dating outside your faith. It's neat, it's tidy, and it doesn't scare the children.
But I'm looking at the text here, and there seems to be a massive hole in that logic.
It's a biological plot hole, to be exact.
Right. The text says that when these 2 groups came together, they produced children who were Nephilim, mighty men, men of renown, giants. Now, I'm no geneticist, but since when does a religious man marrying an atheist woman produce a literal giant?
That is the fatal flaw of the Sethite view. You don't get genetic anomalies just because of a difference in religious belief or moral standing. A believer and a non-believer produce a normal human baby.
Exactly.
The text, however, is emphatic that the offspring were different. They were distinct.
So the safe option fails the biology test. It just doesn't explain the result.
It really struggles there, which forces us to look at viewpoint number 2. The supernatural option.
The angel view.
The angel view.
Okay, this is the one that sounds like the X-Files.
It is, but it's also the view held by the most ancient Jewish scholars, the early church fathers, and actually increasingly by modern academics who focus on ancient Near Eastern literature.
Really?
Yeah. The argument relies on how the term sons of God is used elsewhere in the Bible. You have to let the text define its own terms.
Okay, so where else do we see Bene Ha'Elohim?
The clearest example is in the book of Job. In chapters 1, 2, and 38, the phrase Bene Ha'Elohim appears, and in every single instance, it explicitly refers to angels or heavenly beings.
Every time.
Every time. In Job 38, they're the ones shouting for joy when God lays the foundations of the earth.
So if you stick to the text's own dictionary, sons of God means angels. Period.
That's the linguistic argument. But there is also massive historical support. Have you ever heard of the Book of 1 Enoch?
I've heard the name, but it's not in the Bible, right?
It's not in the standard canon today, no. But it is an incredibly important historical document. Think of it as intertestamental literature. It was widely read and respected by Jewish people in the centuries leading up to Jesus. So much so, in fact, that the New Testament writers actually quote it.
Wait, hold on. New Testament writers quote a book that isn't in our Bible.
Yes, the book of Jude explicitly quotes a prophecy from Enoch. And 1 Enoch is absolutely obsessed with this Genesis 6 event. It details a rebellion where a group of angels, they call them the Watchers, decide to consciously cross the boundary between heaven and earth to take human wives.
So to the ancient reader, this wasn't some big mystery. It was a known story of a spiritual rebellion.
Exactly. And you see echoes of it in New Testament texts like Jude and 2 Peter. They talk about angels who left their proper abode or did not keep their own domain and were thrown into chains of darkness. That makes no sense in the Sethite view.
No.
But in the angel view, it fits perfectly.
Okay, so we have fallen angels crossing the line, and if we follow that logic, the giants, well, they suddenly make a lot more sense biologically.
Right. If you introduce a non-human element into the equation, the Nephilim are viewed as hybrids, demigods.
Which actually sounds a lot like, well, like everything else from ancient history.
Precisely. Greek mythology, Sumerian epics, Norse legends, they all have these stories of gods coming down, mating with women, and producing titans or Hercules or semi-divine heroes. The angel view suggests those aren't just fairy tales.
Right.
They're twisted historical memories of this actual event, just viewed from the other side.
That is a staggering thought, that the myths are just the PR campaign for the rebellion described in Genesis.
Yeah.
But hang on, before we move on, wasn't there a third option, a political one?
Yes, the tyrant view. In the ancient Near East, kings often called themselves sons of gods to claim divine authority. So this view suggests these were just powerful despots building harems, abusing their power.
But again, tyrants don't necessarily produce giant babies.
Correct. It runs into the exact same biological wall as the Sethite view. So if you want theological safety, you go with the Sethite view. But if you want consistency with the original language, the historical context, and an explanation for the weird offspring, the angel view is the heavyweight contender here.
Okay, so let's assume for a moment the angel view is correct. We have this breach of cosmic boundaries. But I want to pivot to the crime itself. Because usually when this story is taught, and I think we see this in pop culture too, there's a tendency to blame the women.
The femme fatale trope.
Exactly. They were too beautiful, and the angels just couldn't resist.
That is a very common reading, unfortunately. But if we perform a forensic audit of the grammar in Genesis 6, verse 2, that interpretation completely falls apart.
So, looking at the evidence on the page, who is the active party?
The active verbs belong entirely to the sons. The sequence is very specific. They saw, and then they took. The text says they saw the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose.
Whomever they chose. That phrase feels predatory.
It is aggressive. And notice what's missing. There is no mention of the women tempting or seducing or even consenting.
They're passive.
The women are the passive objects in the sentence. The focus is entirely on the sons. It compares linguistically to Eve in the garden or David on the rooftop with Bathsheba. The failure happens in the observer.
So it's an internal failure, a failure of the eye and the will.
Exactly. And whether you believe they were fallen angels or just powerful kings, the core sin was the arrogance of power. It was arbitrary selection. They looked at humanity, saw something they wanted, and simply took it, trampling on divine boundaries and the rights of others.
That phrase, arbitrary selection, really sticks out. It implies they felt they were just above the law. Like, I see it, I want it, I take it.
And that is the definition of corruption. When you believe your status, be it spiritual or political, gives you the right to take what isn't yours, That is the moment of the fall. It wasn't a seduction, it was a seizure.
This leads us directly to the consequences,
Right.
which were severe.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the Great Flood. And frankly, this is another area where people really struggle with the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, wiping out the whole earth. It seems like overkill if it was just about some bad marriages or people being mean to each other.
You're right. If the problem was just people sinning, the flood feels disproportionate. God forgives sin all the time. But this is where the angel view really changes the stakes. It introduces what we'd call the species purity argument.
Species purity.
Oh.
That sounds intense. What does that actually mean in this context?
It means that if the angel view is correct, the problem wasn't just that humans were behaving morally badly. The problem was that humanity was becoming biologically, ontologically compromised.
Huh.
If you have angels mating with humans, you are introducing a foreign element into the human gene pool.
You're creating these Nephilim, these hybrids.
Right. They were non-man, non-God. A distortion of human nature. Now think about the bigger picture of the Bible. What is the very first prophecy given in Genesis 3?
That the seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head.
The seed of the woman, referring to?
The Messiah, Jesus.
Exactly. The Messiah had to be a kinsman redeemer. He had to be a descendant of Adam to save the children of Adam. He had to be fully human.
I think I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
If the human gene pool became thoroughly corrupted by this angelic DNA,
then the Messiah literally could not be born. There would be no pure humanity left for him to be born into. The human race would have been effectively replaced by this hybrid race.
wow. So the flood wasn't just punishment. It was a desperate act of preservation.
Think of it like a hardware reset. If your computer gets a virus that is rewriting its core operating code, you can't just run a virus scan. You have to wipe the drive to save the machine.
That is a terrifying but really helpful analogy. The flood was the hardware reset to save the human biology.
Yes. And to carry that analogy further, if the flood was the hardware reset dealing with the physical corruption, Jesus was the software update.
Or a core replacement, maybe?
Right. Jesus comes later to deal with the soul and the sin nature. But you couldn't have the software update if the hardware itself had been destroyed. The flood preserved the vessel so that salvation could eventually come.
That really helps clarify the difference between Old Testament judgment and New Testament salvation. It shifts the view of God from angry destroyer to, well, protector of the future.
Exactly. He was protecting the possibility of salvation.
But speaking of the New Testament and salvation, let's talk about the invisible world today, because we aren't seeing giants walking around. At least I haven't seen any lately.
Oh, fun.
But the argument is that the conflict described in Genesis 6 hasn't stopped. It's just changed forms.
This is where we pivot to spiritual warfare. And I know that term can make people roll their eyes. It sounds like something from a fantasy novel. But we have to ask the question, is the devil just a metaphor for human badness? Is Satan just a poetic way of describing our own dark psychology?
I think a lot of modern people, even religious ones, lean that way. It's much more comfortable to think of evil as just bad choices or trauma response. It feels more scientific.
It does, but logic gets in the way. Specifically, the logic of Jesus. We know from the Gospels that Jesus was tempted in the wilderness by the devil.
Right. The 40 days, the fasting, the whole thing.
Now consider this. If the devil is just a metaphor for a person's internal sin or their dark side, then for Jesus to be tempted by the devil.
Jesus would have to have a dark side. He would have to have internal sin.
Exactly. And that destroys the entire foundation of Christian theology, which is that Jesus was sinless. So if Jesus is sinless, he has no internal traitor to generate those temptations. Therefore, the devil must be an external real entity, a person in the theological sense.
That's a really tight logical argument. If Jesus fought a real enemy, the enemy must be real. You can't be tempted by your own sin if you don't have any.
Precisely. And if the enemy is real, then the war is real. This brings us to a practical strategy that changes how we handle daily life. It's based on Ephesians 6.1 near. We wrestle not against flesh and blood.
This is the hostage concept, right? This actually blew my mind a little because it's so applicable to relationships.
It's a complete reframing of conflict. The idea is this. When you are in a fight, say, with a neighbor, a boss, or a difficult family member, you are not fighting the enemy. You are fighting a hostage.
So the person yelling at me or the boss undermining me, They are the villain.
They are the vessel. The real enemy is the spiritual influence, the accusations, the pride, the fear that is exploiting them. If you attack the person, you're just shooting the hostage. You aren't hurting the hostage taker at all.
That is so difficult to accept in the heat of the moment, but it changes everything. It means you stop taking things personally and you start seeing the bigger picture. This person is being influenced by something else.
It creates empathy, but it also creates strategy. You stop wasting ammo on the wrong target. And this leads to the two-front war concept.
What are the two fronts?
The external front and the internal front. Externally, you resist the devil. That's the enemy outside the gates. You stand firm against the lies and the accusations coming from the world or the spiritual realm.
And the internal front.
That's the harder one. You mortify the deeds of the flesh. That's the traitor inside the gates.
Ah, okay. Because, unlike Jesus, we do have internal thin.
Correct. We have plenty of gasoline lying around. The enemy throws the sparks, but our own ego, anger, and lust are the gasoline waiting to catch fire. The strategy is to dampen the gasoline so that when the sparks fly, they don't ignite.
So spiritual warfare isn't just shouting at demons, it's also working on your own character so you give the enemy less to work with.
Exactly. It's closing the breach in the wall.
We've really covered a massive arc here. We've gone from ancient mysteries of giants and angels to genetic purity and the flood and landed on practical conflict resolution.
It just shows how interconnected these texts are. Genesis 6 isn't just some weird side story or a leftover myth. It sets the stage for why the world is the way it is, why the flood was necessary, and what the nature of evil actually is.
So to recap, the sons of God were likely fallen angels who crossed a divine boundary, creating a hybrid race. The crime wasn't beautiful women seducing them, it was powerful beings taking what they wanted, that arbitrary selection.
And the flood was the resulting system reset to preserve the human line for the Messiah.
And finally, that same taking spirit is still active today, which is why we need to view our conflicts through the lens of spiritual warfare, fighting the influence, not the people.
You nailed it.
Now, before we go, I want to leave the listeners with a final thought that came up in our research. It's a bit of a brain bender.
It's about that phrase we hear Jesus say in the New Testament, angels do not marry.
Right?
People often use that to debunk the angel view of Genesis 6. They say, look, Jesus said angels can't do that.
But there's a nuance there, isn't there?
A huge one. Jesus refers to angels in heaven, the ones who kept their station, the ones who follow the rules.
But the ones in Genesis 6, they're defined by the fact that they broke the rules. They left their station.
Exactly. Saying angels don't marry is like saying soldiers don't go AWOL. Well, good soldiers don't, but some do. And if that's true, if there really was a time in history when the barrier between the spiritual and physical was shattered, creating a hybrid race of mighty men.
That raises a chilling question. Are the mythological monsters of antiquity, the minotaurs, the titans, the demigods, are they actually twisted historical memories of a reality we've tried to forget?
It certainly makes you look at a museum exhibit of ancient statues a little differently, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We'll see you next time.